One of the most important things people in nonprofit organizations have to do is make decisions. And making good decisions and ethical decisions is paramount to the success for that individual and the organization as a whole. So in this lesson, we're going to talk all about leadership and decision making. This lesson will conclude our discussion on that key nonprofit stakeholder group, which is the paid staff. By the end of this lesson, you'll understand the general leadership styles as well as the concept of situational leadership. You'll understand how leaders make decisions in organizations. You'll learn how to apply frameworks to decision making and how to make ethical decisions, avoiding problems in the decision making process. First, let's talk about the common general leadership styles. Now, leaders, they're human beings. No two leader is exactly the same, and every day working in a nonprofit is going to be different than the day that came before it. But when it comes to leadership, there are some general leadership styles that tend to emerge. As a quick refresher, something that we've discussed in a previous lesson, nonprofits are led by an executive director, or sometimes that's called a CEO position, who is overseen in most cases by a board of directors. For most agencies, it's that executive director in partnership with the board of directors that leads the overall organization. In terms of day-to-day staff management, that is typically the purview of the executive director. Leadership is not exactly the same thing as management. Leadership, formally defined, is the use of power and influence to direct the activities of followers toward goal achievement. So in nonprofit terms, that means leaders, being the executive director, board leadership, even volunteer leadership, and staff that are in management roles, they have to gather and garner power and influence. And then it's up to them to use that power and influence wisely and ethically to direct their followers. And by followers, we mean their subordinate staff and in many cases, volunteers toward goal achievement. And of course, in a nonprofit organization, that ultimate goal is achieving the mission. Now, when we look at leaders, there are some general leadership styles, and these represent overarching leadership philosophies that the leader may consistently apply across various situations. And before I describe what these general leadership styles are, I want to point out that none of these is better than the other. None of these is superior, or none of these is the best. Now, as I describe them, I want you to think about your work approach and what type of leadership style you best respond to. And you may have some preferences of, well, I would like a leader that has this leadership style. I don't think I would like a leader who has this leadership style. But let me explain to you these general leadership styles. First is autocratic. Auto means alone or by yourself. So that stands to reason then that autocratic leaders prefer to make decisions by themselves. They don't consult others when they're making decisions, but they just make the decisions and go with it. In contrast, a democratic leadership style, it's like a democracy. With this approach, leaders distribute responsibility among the membership. So by membership, we mean people in that organization. So they empower people in that organization, they involve them in the decision-making process, and they make it sort of as a team, with the leader, of course, having the ultimate authority to make that decision. But it's a democratic process rather than a decision that's made just individually by one person. Laissez-faire, it's a fancy French term. It basically means let it be. This is very much a hands-off approach, where the leader just kind of avoids leadership duties altogether, leaving it up to their followers or the members of the organization to make their own decisions. Transformational leaders are those that really transform an organization and their teams. They motivate through inspiration. They're able to set forth that long-range aspirational vision that we talked about in a previous lesson, and they really work with their team to promote individual development. They really invest in their teams, and they really transform people and organizations. Transactional leaders are those that look at leadership as a transaction. That's why it's called transactional leadership. They expect their employees to achieve certain objectives. They monitor performance closely, and then in return for that transaction is they provide rewards or they fail to apply punishments to their employees or volunteers or people that they're leading in exchange for them meeting those goals, expectations, and outcomes. Servant leaders emphasize the leader's primary role as a servant to their team or organization. And the concept here is that they're serving and supporting the organization and its people by providing resources. Now, servant leadership isn't a term that you generally see in the for-profit sector. It's kind of unique to the nonprofit sector, and there are some criticisms of this term. But a lot of nonprofit leaders like to use this to describe their leadership style as they look at their work as being in service to the mission. And empathetic leaders are those that emphasize things like active listening, empathy, of course, compassion, and they really make it a concerted effort to create a supportive environment of understanding and addressing not just the needs of other people and seeing their perspective, but also addressing their emotions too. Now, life is messy, and it can particularly be messy and chaotic in a nonprofit organization. So there's no such thing as a leader who 100% of the time always embodies the characteristics of their leadership style that we just discussed. In reality, a lot of times the approach that a leader takes to a situation depends on, well, the situation. So let's talk about situational leadership and talk about 4 situational leadership styles. Situational leadership is a very practical approach to leadership because it acknowledges that the who, what, when, where, and why of how we apply different leadership styles can vary depending on the situation. Now, situational leadership styles and general leadership styles, they're not mutually exclusive. In fact, they're complementary and they're often used in conjunction with each other. So in a moment, you'll learn the different situational leadership styles. So I might be an empathetic leader who uses a selling style of situational leadership. So look at these as things that are used in combination with one another. First, let me explain the situational leadership model. This is an organizational behavior theory. It comes from academic research. And this proposes that effective leadership involves adjusting one's leadership style. So yes, we have a general overarching leadership style. We just discussed those 7 general leadership styles. So you can have that one leadership style, but you're going to apply a slightly different leadership style to each unique situation. And in doing so, we're also assessing that unique situation, the person that is addressing that unique situation, and we're determining how we're going to approach that situation. So this model is based on the development level of the follower or the subordinate. And this can be a staff member or a volunteer in nonprofit organizations. And this is what we call readiness. So what is readiness? Well, readiness is broadly defined as the degree to which employees are mature enough and they have the capacity and the skill and the experience and the willingness to accomplish their specific tasks. So depending on an employee's readiness level, that is going to dictate how leaders approach these situations. A telling leadership style involves telling the follower directly what to do. Now, sometimes this is required in certain situations where the follower is not able to do what you're asking them to do, or they're unwilling to do it, or they're not secure in their abilities to do it. Now, these situations are going to require a higher degree of leadership. And it's very common, obviously, when you have a new employee or you're onboarding a new volunteer. Asking them to do a task or a certain set of tasks, you have to be pretty direct in what you're telling them to do. They might be willing to do it. They might have the capabilities to do it, but they just don't have the confidence or the knowledge yet to actually do that task. So this is more of a hands-on approach that requires a higher degree of leadership. A selling leadership style involves a leader attempting to convince a follower of their ideas by explaining the task directions in a very persuasive manner. So in this situation, you're selling the follower to do what it is that you want to ask them to do. This is effective when a follower has moderate low readiness. So they might have the confidence to do the job, but maybe they're not willing to do the job. So you have to convince them to do the task. And that is the selling part. You're selling them on doing the job. A participating leadership style involves sharing ideas and decisions. And with this, it's about buy-in. You want to get your followers to get committed to a task. You want them to feel like they have some skin in the game, and that will make them likely to be more cooperative and actually doing it. And this participating style is most effective when a follower has moderate high readiness, where they're capable of doing a task, but they're not quite yet confident in doing it. So involving them in a participating way, in a collaborative way, helps bolster that confidence so they'll do what it is that you need them to do. And then finally, a delegating leadership style calls for a leader to empower their followers to take responsibility to complete tasks on their own independently. Now, this is a great approach to use when a follower has high readiness. They're capable, they're willing, they're confident, they have the skills, the knowledge, the experience, and the competence to do it. And you basically just have to delegate that task to them. So a leader can have an overarching leadership style. So I can be an empathetic leader in terms of how I approach leadership in general. But how I direct certain and specific followers in the organization is going to depend on the situational leadership approach. So if I have a brand new volunteer, I'm probably going to use a telling approach. If I have a seasoned employee and I'm asking them to plan an event that they've done for years, I'm probably going to use a delegating approach. Plan this event, raise X number of dollars, and go about it your own way. If I have an employee who maybe has been around for a year or two and they're capable of doing a task, but maybe they're not willing to do it because it's outside of their general roles and responsibilities, I may have to use a selling leadership style. So my overarching leadership style might be empathetic, but how I address leadership of individual followers is going to depend on the situation. Now, when we make decisions, they can be one of two types. They're either programmed or non-programmed. So let me explain the difference and why it matters. Now, one of the most important things that leaders have to do is make decisions. Leaders in nonprofits make hundreds, if not sometimes thousands, of even micro decisions on a daily basis when they're running their agencies. Many of these decisions are small, and oftentimes leaders aren't even cognizant of the fact that they're making decisions, but some decisions are bigger and more complex. So this is going to help drive whether we classify these decisions as programmed or non-programmed. And when leaders make decisions, this is actually influenced by their leadership style. Program decisions, these are the easy peasy ones. They're the ones that we don't even think about because we do them basically all day, every day, and they're done automatically. You don't have to think about much. A lot of times you're not even realizing that you're making a decision because you have so much prior knowledge, so much experience, so much competence that you just immediately recognize the situation and you know exactly what you need to do. A non-programmed decision, however, these are your more complex decisions. And this can arise when a problem is new. You've never encountered it before, so you don't know what to do. You have to make the best decision. It might be a complex situation. You have to make a decision that maybe involves an ethical dilemma or a bunch of different options, and none of them is great. Or you have to make decisions on things where you don't have the resources to necessarily adequately carry them out. Or it could just be a situation that you don't recognize. Now, the program decisions, again, those are the easy ones. We don't have to put much thought into them. But with those non-programmed decisions, these complex or new situations that we face, this requires a lot more thought. And good leaders can apply certain approaches to making decisions for non-programmed decisions, especially to ensure the likelihood that they're making the best decision. One of these frameworks is the rational decision-making model. The rational decision-making model comes from academic theory and research. And it basically says that when we're faced with a decision, there is a stepwise approach that leaders can take to making a decision and ensuring that it is the best decision. Now, real life is complex. Leadership is complex. Working in nonprofits is complex. So there's no perfect scenario. And while you can put 6 steps to a piece of paper and say, these are the 6 steps to follow, it's never that cut and dry. But following this general framework will ensure a better likelihood and outcome of making a good decision. And following this approach really challenges leaders to make decisions using facts and information and to examine all the available alternatives to avoid making decision-making mistakes and to also not just make a decision and stop there, but there's more work to it after that. Now, the first step in the rational decision-making model is to identify that there's a problem in the first place. And this might sound kind of silly, but again, in a nonprofit organization, you're faced daily with so many of those program decisions that you don't even think about it. So sometimes when you're faced with a more complex problem, you don't even realize at first that you have a problem. Now, one way we identify problems is through a gap analysis. This is where you're looking at where we're at versus where we want to be and figuring out how to close that gap. Now, a great way to identify problems and a great way to apply a gap analysis is through using those BI dashboards that we talked about in a previous lesson. Now, remember, BI stands for business intelligence. So this is where we're taking all of the numbers of an organization, we're tracking our performance. A BI dashboard makes it crystal clear in beautiful graphic format if you have a gap, at least for financial metrics. So you can't use a BI dashboard for everything in terms of identifying problems. Sometimes problems are people in nature. You've got a problem with a volunteer. You have staff having conflicts with each other. You have a board succession problem. There are a lot of other problems that are not financial in nature, but BI dashboards are one way to easily do a gap analysis, at least on the quantifiable metrics. Now, once you've identified that a problem is occurring, you have to identify criteria for what success will look like. So I have a problem. I know where I want to be. I know where I'm at. But what does success look like? Where do I want to be exactly? What are the criteria for what I will measure the outcome to be successful or not? Now, a lot of leaders make a mistake here and they jump right to evaluating these alternatives. It's not the time for that. Right now, this is brainstorming. What are all the different options that we can apply to this problem to get to where we want to be? Don't evaluate them yet. Don't shoot down ideas, be open-minded, and think outside the box. After you've determined all the alternatives, and only after you've determined all the alternatives, it's then time to evaluate those alternatives. Because if you don't take time to gather all the alternatives and you just pick from the first available ones, you might be missing out on better alternatives. So when you're evaluating the alternatives, this is where you sit down and you really gather facts and you use facts and hard data and information to assess each alternative against each other. And in doing so, you're going to analyze things like what are the potential outcomes? What are the risks and benefits? What are the costs, both financial and indirect? How much time is this going to take? Is this potential alternative going to close that gap between where we are and where we need to be? After doing that, leaders can then look and select and implement the best option that minimizes risks, maximizes benefits, minimizes costs, and has the best outcomes, and they take action. Decision making, according to the rational decision making model, doesn't stop at just implementing a decision. Rather, good leaders have to monitor and evaluate the implementation. They have to make sure that they don't just make a decision, but it's actually implemented. And then they need to monitor it and evaluate it. Is this decision truly the best decision? I thought I knew what the outcomes were going to be, but are they actually those outcomes in reality or not? Are there some things that I missed? Are there some potential downsides that I failed to consider? And measuring these outcomes will ensure that the chosen option is successful. And the best leaders are willing to accept when they don't make the best decision, they don't pick the best alternative, but they're willing to monitor and evaluate and make the determination that they should have made a different choice. And they're willing to accept responsibility and change the course of action to try something else. Now, this model, it comes from academic research. It's an academic theory. It's a model that comes from research, and it makes a pretty big assumption. And that assumption is that decision makers are rational, hence the name rational decision-making model. But we know that in real life, individuals, even the best of them, are not always rational. Emotions can get in the way, personal agendas, ego, things like that can get in the way. And sometimes individuals are not always capable of recognizing a problem and or articulating that problem. And in the nonprofit sector, that's exacerbated by the fact that there are very real constraints like time, financial resources, or other factors. If you're a development director and you're faced with a problem, you probably don't have the time and luxury to cancel a bunch of donor meetings to sit down and methodically go through the rational decision-making process of identifying the problem, doing that gap analysis, and doing all the other steps of it, especially including gathering all of the facts and examining the alternatives. Realistically, you don't have time to do that. But effective leaders, practically speaking, are at least aware of the rational decision-making model, and they try to apply it, even if it's loosely, in their day-to-day decision-making process, especially when it's one of those really complex, non-programmed decisions. Now let's talk about some problems that can arise in the decision-making process. And these are problems that if a leader applies the rational decision-making process to, can hopefully avoid. There are some common problems that human beings encounter when they're solving problems. Bounded rationality basically says that we're bounded. So basically, we're kind of in a bubble. We're constrained by how rational we can be when we make decisions. Why? Because we're not computers, we're not AI, we're not robots, we're human beings. We are limited. We're limited in our abilities, we're limited by cognitive constraints, we're limited by being fully rational because human beings have emotions. So the human factor makes decision-making kind of inherently flawed. Satisficing happens when decision makers, usually because they're pressed for time, they just grab at the first acceptable alternative that is considered. So instead of sitting down and brainstorming and looking at all of the alternatives and then gathering facts and making the best decision for the best alternative, they just satisfice and they just go ahead and they just take whatever sounds good. And this happens particularly in nonprofits because of that resource starvation issue. When you don't have time, you don't have the resources, you're one person expected to make so many decisions every single day. You don't have time to go through the rational decision-making model. You just have to grab at the first acceptable alternative. Analysis paralysis occurs when you excessively scrutinize or overthink options. And while it's important, according to the rational decision-making model, to go through and look at the alternatives, examine the alternatives based on facts, if you get too caught up in the weeds of all of the data and analyzing it, that can lead you to overthinking or second guessing yourself. And as a result, you delay making a decision, or even worse, you fail to make a decision at all. Decision avoidance happens when someone avoids making a choice because they just want to kick the can down the road. They don't want to deal with it right now. They're busy. Maybe you're a development director, you're planning a big fundraising event. There's another problem that comes up, but you're so in event planning mode and fundraising mode, you just don't have time to think about it right now. So you kind of push that for later, put it on the shelf, you'll deal with it later. And this can sometimes happen not just out of time constraints, but out of fear of making the wrong choice or having to deal with potential consequences. You know it's going to be unpleasant. You know the consequences of making the wrong choice can be particularly devastating. So you kind of stick your head in the sand and avoid the problem entirely. And with so many decisions that nonprofit leaders have to make every single day on top of everything else they have to do, decision fatigue is very real. This is a state where you're burned out, you're tired, you don't have the stamina, you don't have the mental capacity because your brain is in foggy mode to make decisions because you're just so drained. Projection bias is another human problem. This is where we project our own thoughts, motives, and attitudes on other people. So you're making assumptions about other people because that's how I wouldn't act or that's what I would think. So you're projecting onto other people. Stereotyping happens when there are assumptions made about others, but this is on the basis of their membership in a social group or other characteristic. And finally, there's escalation of commitment. This is when you're digging a hole, you realize I shouldn't be digging the hole, but instead of changing course and getting out of the hole while you can, you just keep on digging. And next thing you know, you're so deep in, you can't get out. So if you continue to invest in a decision, even in the face of negative outcomes, instead of being willing to own up and say, hey, I made the wrong choice, and admitting failure or losing face, you just keep on with that bad decision. And now that we know how we can rationally approach decision making and solving problems, let's discuss some ethical frameworks that can be applied specifically to making sure that the decisions we make are ethical. Now, some decisions are particularly complex. So these are your non-programmed decisions. They're complicated and or new. And sometimes they're complicated by presenting an ethical dilemma. And we know from a previous lesson that because of the moral disillusionment theory, nonprofits are held to a higher standard. So decision makers and nonprofit organizations have to be particularly careful when it comes to ethical decision making, because if you make the wrong choice and that leads to a perception that the organization or the people within it are being unethical, that nonprofit is being held to a much higher standard than any other organization, and therefore will have greater consequences. So ethical frameworks, these are just structured systems and approaches to guide individuals to making decisions, specifically when they're faced with a moral dilemma, or they have to evaluate between right and wrong. 3 framework options that are great in nonprofit organizations are AFP guidelines, the 4-component model, and the mission test. Nonprofits have to raise money. They have to raise money to fulfill the mission. So raising money is basically the sales of their product, with the product being the mission. So there are a lot of professional organizations out there that are dedicated to assisting nonprofit organizations with that important fundraising task. One of these organizations is the Association of Fundraising Professionals, or AFP. AFP is itself a nonprofit organization, and their mission is to help other nonprofits, specifically through the practice of ethical fundraising. They provide professional education, networking, resources, research that you can access and see their studies, advocacy for the sector, a lot of different things. And one of the things that they do that applies to ethical decision making is their AFP guidelines. They make these available for free to nonprofit fundraising professionals, and one of them is the Donor Bill of Rights. So consulting guidelines like this can really help guide fundraisers when they have to make decisions that present as an ethical dilemma, of making sure that whatever decision they make or whatever path they pursue is in accordance with ethical fundraising guidelines. Now, AFP guidelines, they're kind of specific to fundraising scenarios or decisions that might impact donors or fundraising. But if you're looking at facing a problem or making a decision kind of at that overarching level, the mission test is a really great rudimentary approach that you can apply. And in doing this, you're simply asking yourself, as I make a decision, as I evaluate the alternatives, which of these alternatives best aligns with and supports our organizational mission? Now, you have to be careful with this, though, because sometimes people in nonprofits can twist themselves into pretzels to justify rule bending, which we discussed in a previous lesson, out of that interest of, well, I did this because it helps fulfill the mission. Well, this might actually not be an ethical behavior. So you have to make sure still it's an ethical decision that you're making, because pursuing the mission is important, but you can't do it at all costs, at least in terms of sacrificing the ethics of the organization. But as long as that decision follows other ethical frameworks, using the mission as that pivotal element in decision making can be a great guide for nonprofits. Now, related to the mission test that you can use in conjunction with it or independently is what's called the mirror test. And this is where you're challenged to ask yourself the question, if I make this decision and I look myself in the mirror as a person, as a human being, as someone with morals, values, and ethics, will I feel good about myself if I make this choice? Another is the publicity test, which asks you to consider, could I defend this choice if I woke up tomorrow and it was on the front page of the newspaper or splashed all over social media and going viral? Would I be able to explain and justify why I made that decision? Now let's talk about another decision-making model, the four-component model. The four-component model is specifically applied to ethical decision-making. And this argues that people move through this multi-stage sequence of psychological process while they're making a decision. And these four steps include moral awareness, moral judgment, moral intention, and moral action. First is moral awareness. When you're making a decision, remember, you have to first be aware that you have a problem in the first place. But if it's an ethical problem, you have to be aware that that's an ethical problem. So moral awareness is the recognition that you even have a moral issue in front of you. So having the ability to discern potentially problematic scenarios is that first step of the four-component model. Sometimes leaders make a decision not even realizing that there are ethical considerations until after the fact, and it comes back to bite them. So you have to have the maturity and the awareness to recognize that it's even potentially a moral dilemma. The next step is moral judgment. So now you've recognized that there's a moral issue that exists. Now you have to kind of go in accordance with that rational decision-making model. Now comes the time to gather all your choices, evaluate those choices and outcomes, and figure out which action is the most morally justified. And it's at this step that you can apply things like the mission test, like the mirror test, like the publicity test, and determining your best course of action. The third step is moral intention. It's one thing to recognize a moral situation is in front of you. It's another to make a judgment call between right and wrong or the most moral choice. But the third step is that you have to actually want to commit to the moral course of action. Whether we like it or not, again, human beings are human beings. And even the people that hold themselves to the highest moral standards, sometimes they screw up. And not everybody has the best moral standards either. So you have to be in a situation here where people are willing to prioritize their moral values over their personal values or over personal gain. Now, if we have the awareness, we have the judgment, and the decision maker has the willingness and the moral intent to make an ethical decision, the final step is the moral action. And this is the actual behavior or situation or outcome. And this is where the decision maker takes action to implement that moral decision. Now, practically speaking, in the nonprofit sector where we know resource scarcity is rampant, and nonprofit employees and volunteers are often overburdened, overworked, and tired, is anyone really practically sitting down with a notebook, going through the rational decision-making model, asking themselves, is this a programmed or non-programmed decision? Are they sitting down and methodically going through that four-component model to make sure they're making a moral decision? No, they're not. But the key takeaway here is if you work for a nonprofit or any organization for that matter, having general awareness of these frameworks, specifically that rational decision-making model and the four-component theory, really trying to put it in practice, where at least it's things that you think about when you're faced with decisions and problems. That will help you not just as an individual and one working in a nonprofit organization, but it can apply to every other facet of decision-making in your life as well.